The morning sun barely peeked through the autumn leaves as Mike shouldered his hunting gear and headed into the woods. He'd been hunting in these parts for over 15 years, but today felt different somehow. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the sweet scent of pine needles and damp earth. His boots crunched softly against the fallen leaves as he made his way deeper into the forest. Like every weekend, he'd left home before dawn, hoping to track some deer. His wife had packed him his favorite thermos of coffee and some homemade sandwiches, little things that made these solitary hunting trips even more special. He smiled, thinking about how she always wrapped the sandwiches in wax paper, just the way his grandmother used to do. The forest was coming alive around him. Birds chirped their morning songs, and squirrels scurried through the branches overhead. Mike had always loved these quiet moments in nature, away from the noise of the city and the constant ping of phone notifications. Out here, it was just him and the wilderness. He'd been walking for about an hour, following some fresh deer tracks, when something unusual caught his attention. At first, it was so faint he thought he might have imagined it. He stopped walking and held his breath, listening intently. There it was again. A sound that didn't belong in these woods. A whimper, weak and painful, carried on the morning breeze. Mike's heart skipped a beat. In all his years of hunting, he'd developed a sixth sense for things that seemed out of place. This definitely wasn't the sound of any wild animal he knew. It had a different quality to it, something that tugged at his conscience and made him forget all about his hunting plans. He checked his compass and made a mental note of his location. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, away from the usual hunting trails. As an experienced woodsman, he knew how dangerous it could be to venture off the familiar paths, but something in that cry for help made it impossible for him to walk away. The whimpering grew slightly louder as he carefully picked his way through the undergrowth. He had to stop several times to untangle himself from thorny bushes, his hunting jacket catching on the brambles. The terrain here was rougher, with fallen logs and thick vegetation making every step a challenge. Still, that mysterious sound drew him forward. His mind raced with possibilities. Could it be an injured hiker? A trapped animal? The responsible thing would have been to call for backup, but out here, his phone barely had any signal. Besides, something in his gut told him that whatever was making that sound needed help sooner rather than later. The morning fog still hung low in this part of the forest, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Shafts of sunlight broke through the canopy above, illuminating patches of mist. Under different circumstances, he would have stopped to appreciate the beauty of it all. But right now, his every sense was focused on tracking down the source of that increasingly distressing sound. He paused again to listen, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. The whimpering had changed. It was more irregular now, but definitely closer. He could hear the pain in it, and it made his chest tighten with concern. Whatever was making that sound was suffering, and it needed help fast. As he pushed through another thick patch of undergrowth, the toe of his boot caught on something hidden beneath the leaves. He stumbled slightly, catching himself against a tree trunk. Looking down, he noticed something metallic glinting in the weak sunlight. His blood ran cold as he realized what he might be walking into. This wasn't going to be just another day in the woods. It was about to become something much more important. Mike's heart pounded as he changed direction, abandoning his original hunting path. The mysterious whimpering pulled him forward like an invisible thread, leading him into a part of the woods he'd never explored before. The familiar trails and markers he'd known for years were now far behind him, but he couldn't ignore what his gut was telling him. Something or someone needed help. He pulled out his old leather-bound notebook, the one his father had given him years ago, and quickly sketched a rough map. His dad had always taught him to leave a trail when venturing into unknown territory. Nature demands respect, he'd say, and preparation is how you show it. Those words echoed in Mike's mind as he marked his route with small strips of bright orange tape from his hunting vest. The morning mist was starting to lift, but the trees grew thicker here, their branches weaving together overhead to create a natural canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. The forest floor was carpeted with years of fallen leaves, making each step slightly uncertain. Mike had to test his footing carefully. One wrong step could mean a twisted ankle, and out here, that could spell real trouble. The whimpering sounds were becoming clearer now, but they seemed to echo strangely in the dense forest, bouncing off trees and making it hard to pinpoint their exact source. Mike stopped every few yards to listen, turning his head slowly to catch the direction. His years of tracking deer had taught him patience, and right now, that patience was being put to the test. He checked his watch. It had been almost 40 minutes since he'd first heard the sound. The coffee in his thermos remained untouched, his sandwiches forgotten in his backpack. The morning chill had given way to humidity, and his shirt stuck uncomfortably to his back as he pushed through thick patches of undergrowth. A branch snapped somewhere to his left, and Mike froze. Years of hunting had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every nerve in his body was on high alert. The whimpering had stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence that felt heavy in the air. Even the birds had gone quiet, which in these woods was never a good sign. He stood completely still, controlling his breathing the way he did when stalking deer. 1 minute passed, then 2. Finally, the whimpering started again, closer this time, and with a clarity that made his skin prickle. Whatever was making that sound was in real pain. He could hear it in the way the cries caught and broke, like someone trying to be brave but failing. The undergrowth got thicker as he pressed forward, thorny vines catching at his clothes. He had to use his hunting knife to cut through some of the denser patches, each slash of the blade feeling like it took forever. But the sound was definitely closer now, pulling him forward with an urgency he couldn't ignore. His foot caught on something and he stumbled slightly. Looking down, he noticed odd marks in the earth, signs of disturbance that didn't look natural. As an experienced hunter, he knew what human interference looked like in these woods, and something about these marks made his stomach turn. Someone had been here recently, and they hadn't been here for any good reason. The trees started to thin out slightly, suggesting a clearing ahead. The whimpering was clearer than ever now, with a distinctive canine quality that made Mike's heart ache. He'd grown up with dogs, and the sound of an animal in pain had always affected him deeply. But there was something else too, something about the regularity of the cries that suggested this wasn't a wild animal. As he carefully pushed aside the last branch blocking his view, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds overhead, illuminating the small clearing ahead. Mike's breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene before him. In all his years of hunting, nothing had prepared him for what he was about to find. The whole morning had led to this moment, and he knew that what he did next would matter more than anything else he'd done in a long time. The small clearing was bathed in patches of sunlight filtering through the trees, but what Mike saw made his heart sink. There, in the middle of the space, lay a beautiful German Shepherd, its brown and black fur dirty and matted. The dog's eyes met his, filled with a mix of fear and hope that struck him to his core. This wasn't just any stray. This was someone's beloved pet, and it needed help desperately. Mike had seen plenty of dogs in his life. He'd grown up with them, trained them, loved them, but the sight before him was different. The German Shepherd wore a worn blue collar with tags that caught the morning light, confirming his suspicion that this was a family pet. But what really made his blood run cold was what he saw next. The dog's leg was caught in something that had no place being in these woods. He took a slow, careful step forward, speaking in the gentle voice he used with his own dogs back home. "Hey there, buddy. It's okay. I'm here to help." The dog's tail twitched slightly, not quite a wag, but enough to show it understood his friendly tone. Years of experience with animals had taught Mike that approach was everything, especially with an injured dog that might be scared or defensive. The autumn leaves crunched softly under his boots as he moved closer, still talking in that calm, steady voice. He could see the dog's sides heaving with quick, shallow breaths, but it wasn't growling or showing any signs of aggression. Instead, those intelligent eyes followed his every move, as if measuring his intentions. Mike had always believed dogs could sense when someone wanted to help them, and right now, he was counting on that instinct. He knelt down about 10 feet away, letting the dog get used to his presence. From this distance, he could see what had happened more clearly. An illegal trap, the kind that had been banned in these woods for decades, had caught the dog's back leg. His stomach turned at the sight, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help the situation. Right now, this dog needed steady hands and a clear head. The morning air had grown warmer, but Mike felt a chill as he examined the scene. Whoever had set this trap knew exactly what they were doing. It was hidden well, covered with leaves and debris, right in a spot where an animal might pass through. If it hadn't been for the dog's cries, he might have walked right past without ever knowing it was there. Moving even closer, Mike kept talking softly, sharing his plans with the dog as if it could understand every word. "I've got some water in my pack and some beef jerky too. Would you like that?" At the mention of food, the dog's ears perked up slightly. It was a good sign. Despite the injury, the animal was still responsive and alert. He reached slowly into his backpack, his movements deliberate and calm. The last thing he wanted was to startle the injured dog. He pulled out his water bottle and a small plastic bowl he always carried for his own dogs when they joined him on shorter hunting trips. The sound of water pouring into the bowl seemed unusually loud in the quiet clearing. As he set the bowl down within the dog's reach, he got his first close look at the collar. There was a name tag, though it was too dirty to read clearly. What mattered more was that this dog had a family somewhere, probably worried sick about their missing pet. The thought of his own dogs at home made his throat tight. He couldn't imagine the anxiety of not knowing where they were. The German Shepherd lapped at the water eagerly but carefully, never taking its eyes off Mike. Despite its obvious pain, there was a dignity about the animal that touched him deeply. German Shepherds were known for their intelligence and loyalty, and this one was showing remarkable trust despite its terrible situation. Time was crucial now. Mike knew he needed to free the dog from the trap, but he also knew it wouldn't be simple. The morning was wearing on, and the longer the dog stayed trapped, the more dangerous its situation became. He'd need to use all his outdoor experience and first aid knowledge, and even then, it would be tricky. But looking into those trusting eyes, he knew he had to try. This wasn't just about saving a dog anymore, it was about doing what was right. Mike's wilderness first aid training kicked in as he assessed the situation. The morning sun was higher now, providing better light to work with, but also reminding him that time was precious. He'd taken a first aid course for pets last year, something his wife had suggested after their own dog had a minor accident, and now he was deeply grateful for that knowledge. "All right, buddy," he said softly, keeping his voice steady and calm. "Let's get you out of this mess." He slowly removed his backpack and laid out his supplies on a clean bandana, the first aid kit he always carried, his multi-tool, a small flashlight, and some rope. The German Shepherd watched his every move with those intelligent eyes, as if understanding he was preparing to help. Years of hunting had taught him to always carry more supplies than he thought he'd need. His old scoutmaster's voice echoed in his head. Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Now, as he looked at his gear spread out before him, he said a silent thank you for that wise advice. He pulled on his work gloves and began clearing the area around the trap, carefully removing leaves and debris. The dog remained remarkably still, only whimpering softly when Mike got too close to the injured leg. "You're being so brave," he murmured, maintaining a steady stream of gentle talk. "Just a little longer, and we'll have you free." The trap itself was his biggest concern. He'd seen similar ones before, nasty pieces of equipment that had no place in these woods. But knowing how they worked was different from actually dealing with one, especially with an injured animal involved. He examined it carefully from different angles, looking for the safest way to release it without causing any more pain to the dog. Opening his first aid kit, he took out several thick gauze pads and bandages. He'd need to work quickly once the trap was open, ready to control any bleeding and stabilize the leg. The dog watched him prepare, its ears moving forward with interest as he unwrapped the supplies. Despite its situation, there was something almost human in its patient observation. Mike remembered the beef jerky in his pocket and took out a small piece. "Here you go, friend," he said, offering it carefully. The dog sniffed and took it gently from his fingers. Another good sign. Building trust was crucial right now, and food was one of the best ways to do it. As the dog chewed, Mike noticed its tail wagging slightly, despite the pain it must have been in. The next part would be the trickiest. He needed both hands to work on the trap, but he also needed to keep the dog calm and still. Thankfully, his years of handling dogs came in handy. He positioned himself where the dog could see him clearly, explaining each move before he made it. "I'm going to touch the trap now," he said softly. "It might hurt a bit, but I'll be as gentle as I can." Using his multi-tool, he began working on the trap's mechanism. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air, and he had to pause several times to wipe it away. The dog remained incredibly still, only occasionally making small sounds of discomfort. "You're doing great," Mike encouraged, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking slightly with the pressure of the task. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, he felt the trap's mechanism give way. "Almost there," he whispered, more to himself than the dog. With one final, careful movement, he managed to release the pressure. The dog let out a small yelp, but then the trap was open, and Mike quickly pulled it away. Working swiftly but carefully, he began treating the injured leg. The wound wasn't as bad as he'd feared. The trap hadn't been there long enough to cause severe damage. As he cleaned and bandaged the injury, he kept talking to the dog, praising its bravery and promising that things would be better soon. The German Shepherd seemed to understand, staying remarkably still as Mike worked, those intelligent eyes never leaving his face. For the first time since he'd entered the woods that morning, Mike felt himself smiling. The hard part was done, but he knew this was just the beginning of the rescue. There was still the challenge of getting this large dog back to civilization and finding its family. But looking at the trust in those brown eyes, he knew he'd do whatever it took to see this through. The real challenge began once the trap was removed and the dog's leg was bandaged. Mike stood up slowly, stretching his back as he looked around the clearing. His truck was at least 2 miles away, maybe more, and the terrain wouldn't be easy. The German Shepherd tried to stand but quickly lay back down, clearly unable to walk the distance. "Easy there, big fella," Mike said gently, kneeling back down to stroke the dog's head. The nearest vet clinic was in town, and he knew from his phone's GPS that it was already past noon. Every minute counted now. He looked at his hunting jacket, then at the large dog, and an idea began to form. Taking off his thick canvas hunting jacket, Mike laid it flat on the ground. It was sturdy, made to withstand rough conditions in the woods. "This might work as a stretcher," he said aloud, more to keep the dog calm with his voice than anything else. He'd once carried his own dog this way after it had cut its paw on a hiking trail, though that dog had been much smaller. Using the rope from his pack, he carefully reinforced the jacket's sleeves and bottom hem, creating makeshift handles. His Boy Scout training was coming in handy again. All those knots he'd learned years ago were finally getting some real use. The dog watched his preparations with interest, its ears perking up at each new sound. The next part would be tricky. Mike needed to get the injured dog onto the makeshift stretcher without causing more pain. He'd helped lift injured dogs before, during his volunteer work at the local shelter, but doing it alone in the woods was different. He talked softly to the dog as he positioned himself, explaining each move before he made it. "Okay, buddy, this might be a bit uncomfortable, but I need you to trust me," he said, sliding his hands carefully under the dog's body. The German Shepherd remained surprisingly calm, only whimpering slightly as Mike lifted it. In one smooth motion, he placed the dog onto the reinforced jacket. The relief in those brown eyes when the dog was settled made all the effort worth it. Looking at his phone again, Mike tried to plan the best route back. The regular trail would be longer but easier to navigate. The direct route would be shorter, but would take him through some rough terrain. With an injured dog to transport, he couldn't risk the shorter path. Sometimes the longest way around was the safest way home. The sun was high overhead now as Mike began his careful journey back. The makeshift stretcher worked better than he'd expected, but it was still heavy going. Every few minutes, he had to stop to catch his breath and check on his patient. The dog remained remarkably cooperative, lying still and watching the forest pass by with alert interest. "You know," Mike said during one of their rest stops, sharing some water with the dog, "my wife's going to love this story. She always says I can't go anywhere without finding someone to help." The dog's tail thumped against the jacket at the sound of his voice, and Mike couldn't help but smile. Even injured and in pain, this dog had a spirit that touched his heart. The journey was taking its toll. Mike's arms ached from carrying the stretcher, and sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cool air. But every time he looked down at those trusting eyes, he found new energy. The dog seemed to sense his fatigue, staying perfectly still to make the carrying easier, only occasionally turning its head to lick his hand when they stopped to rest. Finally, after what seemed like hours, he heard the distant sound of cars on the main road. The dog's ears perked up at the noise, and Mike felt a surge of relief. They were getting close to his truck now, but he knew this last stretch would be crucial. The vegetation was thicker here, and he had to navigate carefully to protect his precious cargo from low-hanging branches. "Almost there, buddy," he encouraged, both himself and the dog. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. In any other situation, he might have stopped to admire the beauty of it. Right now, though, his mind was focused on one thing: getting this brave dog to safety before darkness fell. The small veterinary clinic buzzed with activity as Mike carried the German Shepherd through the front door. The receptionist took one look at the makeshift stretcher and immediately called for help. Within moments, 2 vet techs appeared with a proper stretcher, carefully transferring the dog from Mike's hunting jacket. He was caught in a trap, Mike explained, his voice hoarse from the journey. About 2 miles into the West Woods. The lead vet, a kind-faced woman with gray hair, nodded as she began examining the dog. Her gentle hands moved expertly over the injured leg while speaking softly to her patient. The German Shepherd, exhausted but still alert, remained calm under her touch. "You did a good job with this bandaging," she commented, examining Mike's handiwork. "The wound isn't as bad as it could have been, thanks to your quick action." She pulled out a small device and ran it over the dog's shoulder. A quiet beep brought a smile to her face. "Good news, he's microchipped. Let's find out who this brave fellow belongs to." While the vet team worked on treating the dog's injuries, the receptionist began checking the microchip database. Mike sat heavily in one of the waiting room chairs, his muscles aching from the long carry through the woods. He couldn't leave yet, though, not until he knew this story would have a happy ending. The investigation took an unexpected turn when the chip details came up. The dog's name was Scout, and he'd been missing for 3 days. His family had been putting up posters all over town, desperately searching for their beloved pet. The receptionist quickly made a phone call, and Mike could hear the joy and relief in her voice as she spoke to Scout's owners. But there was more to this story than just a lost dog. The vet was concerned about the trap that had caused Scout's injury. "These traps have been illegal in our county for years," she explained to Mike. "We need to report this to the authorities." Mike nodded, pulling out his phone to show her the photos he'd taken of the trap and its location. The local wildlife officer arrived within the hour. He was a serious-looking man who took detailed notes as Mike described exactly where he'd found Scout and what the trap looked like. "We've had reports of poaching in that area," the officer explained. "But this is the first solid evidence we've found. Your discovery might help us crack this case wide open." As they talked, Mike remembered something else. There were other signs of human activity around that clearing, marks in the earth that didn't look natural. The officer's interest piqued at this information. He pulled out a map, and together they marked the exact location where Mike had found Scout. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows through the clinic windows when Scout's family arrived. Mike heard them before he saw them, excited voices and quick footsteps in the hallway. The vet had finished treating Scout's leg and given him some pain medication, making him much more comfortable. When his family entered the room, Scout's tail began wagging furiously despite his tiredness. A young boy rushed forward, tears streaming down his face as he gentle hugged his dog. Scout's whole body wiggled with joy, his earlier pain forgotten in the excitement of reunion. The parents couldn't stop thanking Mike, their eyes shining with gratitude. "We've been searching everywhere," the mother explained, her voice thick with emotion. "We were beginning to lose hope." While the family reunited with Scout, the wildlife officer pulled Mike aside. The trap that had caught Scout wasn't the only one they'd found. A whole network of illegal traps had been discovered in the area, leading to an ongoing investigation of poaching activities. Mike's discovery had helped uncover a much larger problem that had been plaguing these woods for months. As the day drew to a close, Mike watched Scout leaving the clinic with his family, the dog's spirit clearly lifted by the reunion despite his bandaged leg. The wildlife officer had more questions, and there would be paperwork to fill out, but right now, seeing that family whole again made everything worth it. Sometimes, he thought, a simple hunting trip could turn into something much more important. In the weeks that followed Scout's rescue, the quiet woods where Mike had found him became the center of increased attention. Wildlife officers patrolled the area regularly, removing more illegal traps and gathering evidence. The local community, shocked by what had happened to Scout, came together to help protect their beloved forest. Mike couldn't stop thinking about Scout and found himself driving to the vet clinic every few days to check on his recovery. The German Shepherd's eyes would light up every time Mike walked through the door, his tail wagging enthusiastically despite the healing leg. The vet was impressed with Scout's progress, noting that his quick rescue had prevented any permanent damage. Word of Scout's story spread through the small town like wildfire. The local newspaper ran a front-page article about the rescue, complete with a photo of Mike and Scout together at the clinic. People started stopping Mike in the grocery store to thank him for what he'd done. But for Mike, the real reward was seeing Scout grow stronger with each visit. The investigation into the illegal traps led to something bigger than anyone had expected. The wildlife officers discovered that a group of poachers had been operating in several counties, setting up these dangerous traps throughout the protected forests. Thanks to the evidence found near Scout's rescue site, they were able to track down the people responsible. Scout's family invited Mike over for dinner one evening to properly thank him. Their house was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of home cooking and the sound of happy dog feet on hardwood floors. Scout greeted him at the door like an old friend, showing off how well he could walk now. The little boy proudly showed Mike all of Scout's favorite toys and the new bed they'd bought him after his ordeal. During dinner, Scout's family shared stories about him, how they'd adopted him from the shelter 2 years ago, how he loved playing with the neighborhood kids, and how lost they'd felt during the 3 days he was missing. "We've always known he was special," Scout's mom said, watching the dog rest his head on Mike's knee under the table. "But now the whole town knows it too." The experience changed something in Mike. His weekend hunting trips took on a new purpose. He began volunteering with the Wildlife Service, helping them check the woods for signs of illegal activity. His years of tracking experience proved invaluable in this new role. Other hunters in the area joined him, forming a network of volunteers who helped keep the forests safe. Local schools asked Mike to talk to their students about forest safety and wildlife protection. Standing in front of classrooms, sharing Scout's story, he found a new way to connect with the community. The children were especially fascinated by how he'd made the stretcher from his hunting jacket, and many asked if they could learn wilderness first aid too. Scout's recovery became a symbol of hope for the community. The vet clinic started a fund in his name to help other injured animals, and people donated generously. The local animal shelter reported increased adoption rates as Scout's story reminded people of the special bond between humans and animals. One crisp morning, about 6 months after the rescue, Mike returned to those woods with Scout and his family. The German Shepherd showed no fear of the forest where he'd been hurt. Instead, he bounded along the safe trails, nose to the ground, enjoying the adventure with his loved ones. Mike watched him play with the little boy, their laughter echoing through the trees, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The woods were different now, safer, better protected, more appreciated by the community. As they walked, Mike pointed out animal tracks to the boy, teaching him how to read the stories written in the forest floor. Scout stayed close to them, occasionally looking up at Mike with those intelligent eyes that seemed to say thank you in their own special way. That day in the woods had started as a regular hunting trip, but had turned into something that changed not just Mike's life, but an entire community. Sometimes the best things happen when we least expect them, and a simple act of kindness can create ripples that touch more lives than we could ever imagine.